There we go. So, David Chan Smith, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nick, and thank you also, Bernardo, and the other members of the Business History Collective for having me, and for Andrew Smith as well for connecting me. Today, I'm going to discuss a project, the very early stages of a project that's beginning to explore the network of ports surrounding Britain during the early modern period. And these ports, I argue, specialized in what we would now think of as tax avoidance. This builds on earlier research. Research mine has come out, past and present, on the political economy of brandy smuggling. Some of it including these areas like Dunkirk. This explored the concept of market formation, and that article and the research there was the basis for a newer project funded by Shirk in Canada, looking at customs enforcement during the 1720s. And my research assistants have been helping me develop a database of prosecutions, thousands of prosecutions during the 1720s, so we can understand the pattern of enforcement a little better. And I'll be giving a talk on that at Duke in April. If you're interested, I'll be posting that to my Twitter account. So there's a lot of work still to do on this third stage of the project. This is more of an exploratory discussion for me. We're actually working on compiling the statutory framework. Some of my RAs we've already developed sort of a database of about almost 200 different statutes that relate to these kind of regulations in the 18th century. And unfortunately, I was hoping when I proposed this paper initially that I would have had travel to the local archives in the Isle of Man and in the Channel Islands, but that obviously has not happened. So much of what I'm talking about today is going to be from the central archives or regional archives located in Britain as well. So let me begin with those caveats and the kind of background with the humble jersey knit, which some of you may be wearing today. It is a staple, as you know, of modern fashion. And of course, historians have written extensively on the history of cotton and its connection with the growth of capitalism and consumerism. But what I want to do today is focus to open with the knit itself, whose origin is actually in the Channel Islands and the Isle of Jersey. And so these are really, really, I think, important islands. And so part of this talk is really going to be highlighting their importance. And originally, the knit was used for underwear and stockings. And you can see here, these are the locations, a very rough map of the islands. You notice they're closer to France than to England. Now, in their representations to Parliament and the British government during the 18th century, Channel Islanders really liked to claim how extensive this knitting industry was, employing, they said, about 20 to 30,000 persons. This is the usual figure. In the 19th century, there's about 60,000 people just living on Jersey, so that may well be an exaggeration. So the claim was used to wring concessions out of the government to maintain this industry, this knitting industry. The Channel Islands occupied a peculiar jurisdictional space, as they do till today in the British polity. They're still a crown dependency. And they were held by the monarch as relics of the Duchy of Normandy and actually not formally part of England. Thus, their legal relationship with England was repeatedly at issue, all in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and especially as Parliament sought to broaden its regulatory authority during the 18th century. And I would argue that some of what we see today really prefigures the debates in the 1760s and 1770s with the American colonies. So the islanders cannily capitalized on this ambiguity to defend their liberties and privileges, and indeed their separate judicial system, which was actually based loosely on the custom of Normandy. Now, among those privileges was their ancient right to import and export duty-free to and from England. Over time, of course, this freedom was really clipped by statute and attempts by the customs service to control the flow of goods through the island. But the islanders always fought back. They had, under Charles II, obtained two key concessions in 1679. An order in council limited customs enforcement on the island, and a statute protected the duty-free status of their woolen trade. So remember, at this point, export of wool in the Restoration from England is actually illegal, and it has to go through. It's really just finished goods, and the movement of the wool trade is actually run through particular ports. So this was a big concession. Actually, wool smuggling is actually one of the few smuggling offenses which is actually felonious in this period. So under the statute, they could import every year for the Isle of Jersey, for example, about 60,000 pounds of raw wool onto the island. and the other islands also have allocations. The Channel Islands, interestingly enough, also had some rights to export goods duty-free into France that they had obtained through 17th century treaties, though these get completely whittled away in the 18th century. Through these means, Jersey and also Guernsey used their knitting industry to position themselves as passages through the customs wall erected by both nations. The humble Jersey knit is thus part of the long-term story of tax havens, or as I'll call them, conduits, in which these goods are moving with very little duty on them through Guernsey and Jersey. Now, the Channel Islands didn't just stop with wool. They had one other crucial advantage, and that was their authority to administer their own customs. The Order in Council in 1679 had really left one officer, one customs officer alone on Jersey and Guernsey, the registrar. And the registrar had no power of enforcement. They simply certified goods under the statute of 1679. They observed, they recorded, and the islanders produced, in fact, their own paperwork. Now, true, the island did have some small duties, mostly to pay for things like anchorage and the harbor and so forth, but they were substantially lower than the mainland. So their privileges of duty-free trade, self-interested enforcement, and the willingness of the islanders themselves to take advantage of their intermediary position between France and Britain had by the later 17th century made them, in the words of one governor of Guernsey, the magazine of all contraband goods from England. This was done, he urged, under the color, his word, of the grant of duty-free wool, an allowance that really enabled the importation of wool from throughout the British Isles, including Ireland, through these islands into France and Holland. So one of the objections even in the 17th century is basically there's no way they can be using this much wool that they're allocated on the island. And they also just mix other wool that's brought in. So this was no straightforwardly illicit port. Many of the imports into the island were legal or effectively legalized. What happened to the goods after they left the island depended on the carrier. Merchants might find ways to legally export the goods, but this was also, and this is a term I'm going to use, hybridized system that connected legal traders with professional smugglers. So this talk is really about discovering the larger network of jurisdictional peculiars, of which Jersey and Guernsey forms important nodes. And you can see there the argument that I'm making that there is a network of these ports and jurisdictions, that they're very connected, they're very intentional. And we can conceptualize this network as conduits. And the context is going to be the growth of the fiscal military state, as we'll see in a moment. So the concepts that I'm testing today are that first, I argue that there is a periodization that applies to the development of these conduits. And the periodization is really, from what I'm looking at today, from about 1660s all the way into 1760s. And then the system transforms. And this is a particular period. And there's a lot of changes within the period that we'll get to in a moment. That it is quite intentional that these ports and also the people living on these islands and also sometimes proprietors and those who hold these liberties intentionally develop this system. That the system is dynamic, and this is one of the hardest things to, I think, really get a hold of, because it's constantly changing and evolving, especially as the tax statutory environment is shifting. It is intentional, as I said already, sorry, repeating myself, and hybridized. So it is not just a lot of the literature on this material really sees them as sort of smuggling ports, but in fact, there's a lot of legal trade here, and it's deliberately is used to obscure a lot of the illicit trade as well. So there's a hybridized trade between legal merchants and smugglers, and you may choose as a merchant only to participate in part of the trade, maybe not the completely illegal part. I'm also going to close at the end with a discussion of how they are useful, with a discussion of Liverpool, the Isle of Man, the slave trade, to imperial expansion. And the structure of the discussion is going to really focus on some examples, discussion of the Channel Islands, I'll get to networks, and then the Isle of Man. So that's where we're going from here. So let me then continue on. I'll answer some great questions here about the conceptualization in the chat at the end, but that's the overall structure. So first, I'm obviously positioning this talk and this material within the larger history that's being developed of tax havens. And in a way, I think it does pose a bit of a challenge to that particular historiography, which really looks at the development of this tax haven system from anywhere, depending on who you're looking at, from the 1880s. People call the 1920s the Big Bang, with the Swiss development of tax havens and the cantons there. And really that story, the modern story, is a story that's connected very closely with a history of corporate development. And it's really connected with that, I think. And also with the growth, in their words, of state sovereignty, and then more recently with the colonization of empire, and then the neoliberal movement of capital. So there is a distinct historiography that says, well, tax havens really come about as a consequence of the development of the corporate form, as a consequence of state sovereignty, in particular tax regimes around income and also corporate tax. So I don't want to suggest that we can transpose the idea of tax havens whole cloth onto the past. The context was similar, but very different. And the terminology was also different. Contemporaries often referred not to tax havens, but to free ports, though I would argue that many of these ports are not actually free entirely. Business organization was also dissimilar. Corporations like the East India Company could also commit tax frauds. I actually have a very interesting case where they did this, but they were not the principal actors in our story. Most transnational business was organized through partnerships in companies of merchants and characterized by self-organization and personal relationships. The tax context was different too, as you can see from this chart here. They existed within a world, these traders and corporations, within a world of evolving fiscal military states that depended, in Britain's case, on customs duties to fund their armies and navies. So the tax context is not necessarily income tax, certainly not corporate tax. It's actually customs and excise. So you can see from the chart here, the growth mostly of excise. Customs is slowly growing here. Basically, customs will provide about 20 to, depending on the year, it could be as high as like 30% of the overall revenue of the English crown. The excise will provide more over time. Generally speaking, the two, customs and excise, are providing about 2/3 of the English crown revenue throughout the 18th century. And as people know, there's a lot of work on this. Patrick O'Brien, Julian Hoppett, John Brewer have all discussed the development of this tariff and customs regime. Now, as it's also well known, the growth, and it was certainly commented on at the time, generates incentives to smuggle these high tariffs. And some of these tariffs are prohibitory. There are outright bans of products, especially in terms of war. And certainly by the 1740s, and I would argue definitely earlier, there are large organized, and in the language of the historiography, gangs of smugglers who roamed the southern coasts and were certainly able to outgun and outnumber customs agents at various times. So smuggling as a topic has drawn a lot of recent interest, especially in the context of Britain's empire in the Caribbean. Really sophisticated work has been done here. I think less recent work has been done on the British Isles themselves, though that is changing. And the task is really to deepen this literature and to clarify a series of connections. First, the functioning of networks of tax avoidance and evasion on a regional and then oceanic and global level. And especially, and this is my particular interest, their relationship with legitimate business, quote unquote. And today, that's what we're really going to do, this hybridized near network. So as a network, I suggest it formed an early system of tax avoidance. And curiously, as we'll see, if we look at some of the major tax havens today, we will actually see 7th, and you see different rankings, Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man. So their status is still as places where you can do business offshore and potentially avoid onerous tax regimes on the mainland. So really, this is now part of extending that history of their participation in these tax avoidance networks further back in time. So, as I've said, it's a very different context for these early modern conduits. And let me just go on. So what I'm going to do is start by first arguing that we changed terminology, and this may answer some of the questions then in the chat, that we look at them as conduits, which I think is a way of understanding their kind of plumbing through the various walls of these custom and tariff blocks. And this is a kind of a move that's also been made within the tax avoidance, tax havens literature. Tax havens is seen as in a way too broad a term. And instead, this language of sinks and conduits has been adopted to really study, in the modern case, the flow of capital, its retention within some of these havens, and also in other havens, its movement onwards. These havens act as intermediaries. So I think I can talk more in the question and answer if people are interested, that the notion of a conduit is particularly useful in a tax avoidance environment as it was in the 18th century. It's really focused not around the mobility of capital, but the mobility of goods themselves, moving through different systems in customs regimes. Okay, so let me then go on. I want to explore the concepts, starting with the Channel Islands, this notion of periodization and intentionality, which I'm going to attribute to the Channel Islands. I've argued that there's a periodization from the 1670s to the 1760s. The 1760s represent a crackdown by the British government on the system and also on the American system. I think that we can join those phenomena. And it's connected to a rise in trade goods and a customs regime that is expanding. And I think actually the 1720s are a particularly pivotal decade in Britain's case. The expansion of the customs systems and the flow of trade goods creates arbitrage opportunities and demand. And Guernsey and Jersey are key nodes in this emerging network. So let me then turn to, oh, I went back the wrong way. To the issue of what do places like Jersey and Guernsey really have to offer that will keep the central government away from you? Why doesn't the central government just shut down all of their privileges and stick rafts of customs officers on the islands? Well, the answer is explained here. I mean, this is, I think, a famous painting that most people probably recognize, the death of General Wolfe, that begins a kind of genre in English imperial painting of the kind of death of the commander, and you can see it's very structured. There's a famous triangular structure, and you can see an indigenous person here, at the kind of looking up at the death of General Wolfe and so forth. So this is a well-known painting of the kind of the valor and expansion of the British Empire on the Plains of Abraham. Less well known, I think, is this painting, which represents the Battle of Jersey, which is also participating in the same genre. And this is the death of Major Pearson in 1781, the commander of the counterattack against a French surprise attack on Jersey in 1781. And you can see here the same conventions are followed. This is Pearson's servant, Pompey, who is in the kind of story that comes out of this episode, shooting the sniper who shot Pearson. And what this means, what this really represents, is that even in 1781, maybe especially in 1781, Jersey and Guernsey are really military outposts on the frontier lands against France. And in fact, they have large military contingents who are stationed there, even in peacetime, in order to defend the island. So what does the island have to barter with? Well, the island has to barter with this kind of military importance, and also to some extent that they make less hay of it. Their position is basically privateering ports. So military value often gives these conduits an opportunity to bargain with the central government. And the Jersey and Guernsey never tired of rehearsing the many ways that they had been loyal through their defense. They really cite, for example, the invasion of Avon of Wales in 1372, where they fought and beat them back, and so forth. And so the position of the island so close to France, they claimed, was really important to the British government, required extensive fortifications that needed to be paid for, a harbor that needed to be managed, and therefore they insisted on local autonomy over the collection of taxes. And always there's an underlying threat that if the British government doesn't do what they want, there's the loyalties of the islanders might be lost with the wrong policies. And this is actually explicitly stated in Privy Council documents and so forth. They're actually quite concerned about this higher up in the government. So throughout the period and well into the 18th century, the government's response was explicitly linked with maintaining the loyalties of the island. The measures of 1679 were thus something of a compromise, and certainly later favored by the islanders. But they did enable and helped enable the islands to expand as entrepot, there's that word, of a variety of goods from Asia and Americas and continental Europe, joining other ports in this network. And I've created a map for you, which I'll show you in a moment. Now, there wasn't just the kind of jurisdictional peculiarity. Trade on the island benefited from many other services and advantages. I mean, what did a conduit actually provide for those who chose to do business there? The most important of these advantages was the islanders' authority over the enforcement of customs rule with no review by the English customs commissioners. Local officials often provided important paperwork services, such as cockett and bills of landing, that could obfuscate the destination origins of items. This is a big complaint by the customs. Next, merchants on these islands had expertise in understanding the complex statutory and transnational requirements. They were sophisticated specialists. I could go on, but Guernsey traders, for example, dealt in wine at Bordeaux, in Nantes, routed it through Holland, so forth. Channel Island merchants, through this kind of network, had informants who kept them abreast of shifting market and regulatory conditions. And this was really a dynamic network. It's constantly evolving. I can't stress that enough. Ports shifted their commodity specializations over time. In the 1720s, Dunkirk became the major port for brandy reshipment, pushing actually Guernsey out of that position, while Boulogne diversified their business over the years from brandy to tea and coffee, depending on the supply of low-cost goods they could obtain. This expertise in the jurisdictional safe havens that these conduits provided enabled them to function as sites for repackaging and relabeling. This is actually another very important service. Thus, for example, larger barrels of wine or brandy could be repackaged into smaller casks for easy smuggling if the smuggler was your client. And a complex supply chain developed over time, not just of commodities, but of the packaging that was needed for those commodities. So, for example, the Channel Islands looked to St. Malo for smaller barrels for brandy and wine repackaging. And finally, they were part of a much larger global network through which their relationship with major company trading centers existed. And I really want to emphasize that there is a corporate dimension to this. They trade frequently to Nantes, Ostend, and Gothenburg, which are the French Imperial and Swedish India Company ports. And they also had direct control over their own Atlantic trading networks. Jersey traders, Jersey had traditionally historically been involved in the cod trade to Newfoundland, and they used Newfoundland actually as a route to transit commodities for the American market. And this is very, very intentional. So what was the central government to do about it? They certainly knew about it. Documents in Walpole's hand survive discussing the trade moving through the Channel Islands and especially Man, the Isle of Man. Statutes were passed to attempt to restrain opportunities for arbitrage. Most commonly, these restricted the duty-free privileges of islands like Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man, only to goods that were the growth or manufacture of the island. So there does seem to be some certificates created at different times from the authorities on those islands saying certain commodities are actually growths or produce of the island. They seem to export a lot of wool from sheep on their island, for example. These tended to encourage falsification or to hybridize the trade further between ostensibly legal traders who might conduct goods to the island and professional smugglers who purchased and moved them onwards. What was needed was actual enforcement on the island, and this was really fiercely and intentionally resisted, and the customs really tries to do this. Now, the success of that resistance had both to do with the arguments of the Channel Islanders, but also with the conflicting goals among different levels of government. So I also want to step away from this notion that the British government is a monolithic entity. So on the one hand, customs clearly saw the need to introduce officers onto the island to control the trade. They advocate very strongly for this. Yet higher up, especially on the Privy Council, there was a recognition of the larger danger of alienating the islanders as the islanders play that military strategic card. So they each have very different perspectives on the problem. Now, there were two activist phases, first under James II and then under George III. And I'll talk very briefly about the James II phase to give you an example of what the islanders are going to do to prevent this enforcement from going on. And of course, as maybe known to this audience, James II does try and more closely regulates all of the colonies under British control, or English control at that point. So the first campaign under James began with an order of 1685 in response to complaints that the island had become a center for tobacco smuggling. It was observed that the quantities of tobacco exported to the island, often duty-free and claiming the drawback, could not possibly be consumed by all the inhabitants. They just couldn't smoke enough to use it all. And so it was assumed that it was either being smuggled back into Britain or elsewhere. Now, James's order expanded the powers of the registrars of the island to board ships. This was a big move. And this was followed by further orders in 1685 that empowered customs officers to search warehouses and cellars, really big, and also provided additional officers, including a boat for each of the islands. Now, the islanders responded and attempted to shift policy in 1688, and they made the traditional arguments that this was a frontier place and that these orders were contrary to the privileges of the islands. These petitions came with a warning that the commerce on the island would come to a standstill given the interference by the officers. And this was actually another thing they claimed, that the islands would become a charge on the crown. So the military fortification, the harbor would all end up devolving onto the crown for payments and costs. And in fact, actually later on, especially when the crown starts estimating more in the 1650s and 1660s, the cost of imposing kind of more extensive customs officers and so forth, it is quite expensive. What the islanders wanted and what they wanted consistently was a return to the conditions of the Order of 1679, that there would be a single officer on their island with no enforcement power. So what followed was really a simmering confrontation that was really felt most harshly by the local registrars. One I think the standout features of the period, though it may not be significant, was actually the shortness of their tenure. They only lasted a couple, sometimes 2 or 3 years. Whereas in 1764, for example, the Registrar of Jersey had served in the position for over 20 years. So there was a real revolving door of these registrars. Now, this may have been due to the difficulties the islanders put in the way of the registrar and his officers. On both islands, the registrars complained of not only being obstructed, but their officers being beaten in the course and performance of their duties. And there's lots of stories about that. Yet at one point, the registrar of Jersey complained that soldiers and officials on the island had helped detain French goods from him that he had attempted to seize. When he went to the courts there, he was told that the order creating these new customs regulations had not been registered on the island and was therefore of no force, and he would get no help from the local officials. The next registrar there complained that no lawyer on the island would plead on his behalf for customs seizures, and the jurates of the island refused to enforce his seizures. Okay, so the officers of the island, the law courts, would refuse to enforce the seizures. Now, interestingly, the new government of William continued the policies of James II. They may have been strategic because of the embargo on France, and the opposition to the islanders appears to be somewhat muted. It may be because they were preoccupied with privateering. They certainly used the prize good channel to transit commodities that were not actually seized as prizes, and there's attempts to clamp down on that. Yet in 1708, when the old orders were amended, the islanders sent delegations to the Treasury Board and Privy Council. At that point, they seemed to have had enough of this. They wanted to return to the rules of 1679. Although the customs fought hard to preserve their entry into the island, the Treasury Board was instructed they should be as easy as possible with the islanders, so there would be no further cause of complaint. The islanders were also seeking discretion to exercise the Navigation Acts, and Jersey, I believe, wouldn't even enforce it. They refused to enforce the Navigation Acts. The compromise that was reached involved the council issuing orders that were, I think, somewhat astonishing. It's a total backtrack. These orders now exempted goods shipped to any foreign countries from the new regulations, so they couldn't be searched or seized, on condition that the jurates of the island put into force the acts of navigation and prohibit commerce with France. The additional officers were either recalled or abolished, and only one officer to remain after peace with France. So the islanders really won this. And the customs attempted again in 1716 and 1720s to place officers on the island. They tried many different schemes. The islanders sent deputations, and they actually just kill these schemes. It's never put into force. So the consequences by the 1720s was that only the registrars remained, but they had power only to handle certificates and observe the going on in the island. By the 1760s, we get a full picture of the developments of the network. So if we fast forward 40 years, we discover this network has been quite active. And it was reported by the registrars in the 1760s that the wool trade through Jersey continued. Jersey traded East India goods to Newfoundland for distribution into the American colonies. Guernsey dealt in a variety of products, everything, tea, brandy, Geneva, from throughout Europe. The islanders traded with the West Indies. They brought back rum. And interesting enough, they had very extensive contacts with Scandinavia. Interestingly, smuggling into England from Guernsey was actually reported to have been in the wane. So straightforward smuggling was actually reported to have been on the wane. Instead, in a kind of imitation, not imitation, but a kind of replica of what Switzerland does with Liechtenstein and Luxembourg, is that Guernsey seems to be using Alderney, another one of the Channel Islands, to actually, that's where the smugglers are located, and to move the goods offshore from Alderney. So what do we learn from the Channel Islands? First, I think we learn the intentionality of the islanders in developing their jurisdictions as conduits for hybridized legal and illegal trade, and a suggestion of a periodization, 1660s, 1670s, to the 1760s, when custom offices in late 1760s, 70s are finally, I believe, I have to confirm this, I haven't been able to check the archive on this, finally established on the island. Lastly, it suggests the dynamism of the network and the reasons why central government didn't simply suppress the trade. So let me then turn to this concept of hybridization and dynamism in this next step on the actual larger network, and then we're going to get to the Isle of Man in the remaining 10 minutes. So the network it points really to this near network, which is very clear. I think if you look at the customs report, published accounts, mercantile correspondence, there is a distinct group of ports identified in red here, and there are more. Ambleteuse, for example, is probably one of them. There are many, possibly in the north. We'll talk about that later. And sometimes, again, these were known as free ports. They all have their distinctive histories. I was going to actually talk about Dunkirk today, but there's not enough time. Now, these ports connected to key entrepôts in the kind of global networks, places like Amsterdam, and also kind of key company ports like Ostend and Gothenburg. Importantly, as was well known, some of these companies were advanced by British traders, some of these East India companies. So the Swedish East India Company that traded through Gothenburg was partly founded in 1731 by a Scot, Colin Campbell. And it perhaps then is no coincidence there seems to have been a strong trade links between the Isle of Man and Sweden, where tea was obtained. So these were not simply smuggling networks, as I tried to make clear. They were hybridized, they were conduits, and their jurisdictional spaces enabled the connection between fully illicit smugglers and otherwise legal traders who could meet on these spaces. The latter could bring goods onto the island, often legally, that were then taken onward for trade by smugglers or perhaps by other legal merchants. So what I want to do to explore this notion of hybridization is now turn to the Isle of Man as an example in the last 7 or 8 minutes. Now, the Isle of Man is really, really interesting. It is a liberty of the Earls of Derby and the Dukes of Athol. It had been a liberty for the Earls of Derby since the 15th century. The island had many advantages to its status as one of these conduits. Customs had no enforcement authority, for example, on the island due to its status. It's at the very center of the Irish Sea. And duties were instead collected by the officials of the person who held the liberty, the proprietor. An important incentive to keep down the costs of administration, because those duties are actually quite low. Now, contemporaries record that around 1700, surely before, though, there's a lot of activity on the Isle of Man. The fortunes of the island increased markedly. The trade was growing. And this is kind of arguably, if you look at the statutory framework, this must have been something of a kind of a golden age, because the statutory framework hadn't really caught up with Man yet, which also claimed the right of duty-free import and export. Man became the most notorious British harbor for trafficking outside of the Channel. A captain of a customs sloop in the 1720s, for example, reported on smuggling activity on the islands, and he described no less than 30 sail loading brandy and other goods in one visit to the island in the port of Douglas. Now, Dutch traders from Rotterdam, Zeeland, Amsterdam transported goods to the Isle of Man, including, as we shall see, goods for the African trade, especially it was coming out of Liverpool. Now, Parliament responded in 1725 with the passage of an act that prohibited imports from Man unless they were the produce or manufacture of the island. This is kind of the standard statutory response. That same year, Parliament also authorized, interestingly enough, the purchase of the rights over the island from the Earl, but the government did not act on that. I found some interesting correspondence on that. Now, supposedly at that point, 1725, 1726, in the force of the statute, supposedly commerce then stagnated until the death of the Earl of Derby in 1736, who had no direct male heir. Then the island passed into the possession of the much more enterprising Duke of Athol, James Murray. Here he is here. Now, Murray was well connected. He served as Lord Privy Seal. He was quite active in Parliament. And curiously, it was only after his death in 1764 that Man was resumed to the crown. So he clearly wants to hold on to it. Under his control, proprietary revenues in Man increased tenfold. In fact, it becomes a nice little profitable island for him. There's always a concern for these people who hold the liberties that these liberties are going to be costs to them, right? So how did he do it? How did he create his little tax haven or his conduit? Now, contemporaries attribute a lot of intentionality to him, that he deliberately gave, in their language, refuge to what they termed fugitives from all about the Irish Sea, Scotland, Ireland, and the West Countries. And this is a not so, I think, subtle appeal to this idea of the fair versus unfair trader, i.e. anyone involved in this whole system must be a naughty smuggler, unfair trader, immoral, and so forth. But in fact, many of these people were highly qualified and specialized merchants. But Murray also reconstructed the island's administration, in particular by making the island's controller, who was in charge of financial records, also a collector of duties. Now, contemporaries thought this was really a move of genius because it incentivized the controller to participate in any scheme that involved mainland customs evasion because he himself would profit, and also to keep an eye on the profits for the Duke of Athol. And schemes were certainly tried. And so, again, in contemporary representation, the idea is that there's sort of test runs that people do to see if they can get through the customs rules. And supposedly, the first trial was for the importation of tobacco from England, which was then resmuggled back again and into Ireland. This practice, which at first was attempted secretly, was then done openly and publicly. This also contemporaries thought was really, as they put it, a masterly stroke of policy by doing it openly, because it allowed for not only the more thorough collection of duties, because everyone knew that you then had to run through Douglas or one of the other ports, owing to the Duke, but it also encouraged other people to join in this profitable trade. The business very quickly became cosmopolitan, with Scots and Irish joining traders on the island and linking to existing smuggling networks, if they weren't already there, around the Irish Sea, especially in Dublin, Greenock in Scotland, in the Channel Islands, and of course the wider network of Holland, Gothenburg, and other places. And there's a whole story about the Channel Islands becoming, or sorry, Isle of Man becoming, it's growing. There's lots of warehouses built and so forth. And you can see here, this is taken from contemporary sources who are very interested in the Isle of Man. Where are the goods coming from? And the one arrow that's missing here is that there's supposedly a large importation of rum coming from the West Indies. Now, there do not seem to have been customs officers stationed on Man. Actually, sorry, there was probably one or two, but they had no authority and they simply observed. Now, we might think that Man is seen as a kind of a drain on the imperial ambitions of the crown. And in this last section, I now want to turn to how it was actually through these quote unquote self-organizing networks, and I'm calling on that literature, how it actually was a source of private initiative that gave at least some traders in England, especially Liverpool, a cost advantage to trade on the African coast. So groups of merchants, some of them with pre-existing Liverpool connections, joined this now booming trade in the Isle of Man. The Murrays, different Murrays, for example, were connected to Liverpool. They had long-standing connections to some of the big trading houses in Liverpool. And there were also Irish merchants involved who migrated to the island. And finally, after 1745, we have the appearance of very large indigenous Manx merchants who dominate the trade. Now, the quantities involved that these people are running through are very significant, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of goods. Francis Wilkins has done really impressive work kind of calculating some of this movement. And Ken Morgan, as well as Wilkins, has argued that the relationship with Man provided Liverpool with an important cost advantage in its competition with other ports. And for the interest of time, I'll sort of abbreviate this section. But contemporaries certainly acknowledge this. They noted that the Liverpool merchants had built, for example, a range of noble warehouses in Douglas where goods were stored. Let me get this here. And they even provided the barrels to the islands, especially sized for the trade, and into which, once brought from Liverpool onto the Isle of Man, French and Spanish brandies might be poured. Now, Wilkins and other people in documents I have shown really this trade is quite, in terms of the goods, where there's a tremendous variety of goods on the Isle of Man, everything from that would be used in the Guinea trade, everything from gunpowder to brass pots, to cottons brought in from around Europe and presumably brought in from India. And that they are largely duty-free, at least on the island. There's almost no duty paid on a lot of the stuff. The duty, for example, for brandy, which apparently was in demand on the coast, is like a pence, right? I mean, it's nominal, right? So the example of Man, and I'm looking at the clock here, this illustrates the hybridized quality of the trade. These islands did not simply serve smugglers dropping casks in the sea off the English coast. Professional merchants participated in segments of the trade, used the islands to obtain tax advantages, and even traded through the islands in order to acquire low-cost goods. traders on the island might sell to merchants, and depending on the product and destination, those goods, maybe we could, certainly depending on the period, might never actually be illicit, though they might end up being essentially duty-free. But they had other customers too, certainly smugglers, professional smugglers. So to close, I've suggested that the Channel Islands are more, and also Oman, that sort of this first era of conduits ended in the 1760s. Alongside efforts to reform American customs, officials in Britain finally purchased the island. They revested the island in 1765 after the death of the Duke of Atholl. Now, these developments certainly reflected the will of a more muscular imperial state and one increasingly anxious about the size of the national debt. These conduits certainly had long-running disadvantages from the perspective of the British government. They were thought to be channels of subversive information, and people were well aware that they affected the balance of trade. So contemporary estimate is about the illegal flow, quote unquote, is about identical to the legal flow of most of these commodities. So, it's 50-50. The ports, though, did represent an idea, the most extreme expression of which was the free port. And of course, there's a scheme in the early 1730s considered by Walpole to turn England into a free port, a kind of scheme that's now come back into vogue, apparently. But these ports also had other advantages. Smugglers could also be agents of the state on behalf of Britain. The existence of privileged conduits like Guernsey and Jersey met and kept happy local demands, maintained important buffer regions against France, and they could also provide cost advantages to English traders. And they were also driven by private interests and private parties. And I think that there's opportunities here to think about how this is happening in the 1730s in the Caribbean, where English traders are clearly trying to, through contraband networks, enter into Spanish trading networks. So to close, future directions, early stages yet. I obviously need to spend time in the Channel Islands local archives. I want to develop a prosopography of these individuals and their relationships, mostly for the period from around 1700 to 1730. We're at work reconstructing the statutory and legal framework. One of the most important sources for this period, it's almost never been touched, are actually Attorney General's opinions, because a lot of these jurisdictional disputes are unclear. And so the customs is constantly referring cases for the opinion of the Attorney General. So we actually I have actually almost a complete run of these opinions for this early period. Most importantly, though, this is really, I think, in the long term, if it goes forward, really a team project. It really requires specialists from France, the Netherlands, working on those areas, who can actually help join together and understand the functioning of this network. And I close with that. Thank you for listening.
I'll give you a round of applause, David, on behalf of the group, because that was a really excellent talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and real history, real good old-fashioned history, archival research. I can tell you've been going through, correspondence files and letter books, and doc duties, customs excise books. It's just really good historical research, and it's generated quite a lot of comments in the chat. So without further ado, I will jump straight into some of the questions. First of all, just to acknowledge Kyle Marston. You won't be using this model to set up a tax haven. Oh, well, I don't think he gave us quite enough information for that, but it's good to hear. And if I can just move on to this little exchange between Andrew Smith and Neil Mackenzie. Andrew, do you want to come off mute and elaborate on that point? Andrew? I think that was a big no. Okay, so we're splitting it. I thought...
Well, Nick, Nick, can I just answer actually the question? Because I think that the answer is there. I mean, entrepreneur, I think, is a more general term. So I think in the literature, for example, Amsterdam is frequently referred to as an entrepot. So I don't think it's specific to, as I think, as Neil said, really specific to tax avoidance. I would say that they are entrepot of a type, right? But it's not a specific enough term for the phenomenon that I'm getting at.
Fair enough. Well answered. Thank you. My question, I was just worried, I just wanted to provoke some further questions, but if I just asked if you knew about how access was gained to these tax havens or to these smuggling networks, if it was this was sort of engineered through, illicit trade networks, or was it through merchant trader networks, or anything, or was it even official channels? Do you have any information on that?
So as far as I can tell, reports to the islands and correspondence, mercantile correspondence is pretty open on these islands, right? And some merchants will, so for example, with the 1720s data, we definitely have merchants who are caught basically capitalizing these smuggling networks, right? And they do so from a distance, right? They're never really potentially liable, or they're not going to be caught by the customs. They have people who run the goods. So I was going to give an example in this talk. There's a bunch of great examples where, for example, English merchants, or even English merchants abroad, for example, who basically employ, say, runners, right, from one of these ports. So the transaction at the port is quote unquote legal. The runners will then drop it in somewhere on the southern coast of England. It then will be taken to legal dealers, so who will then sell, say, the brandy or whatever else is being smuggled. So the merchants are sometimes actually capitalizing. And for example, we know of companies of merchants that are mentioned in Dublin, and there's a bunch of big ones in Holland, who are actually, paying for these smuggling ships and so forth. So there's a very kind of open kind of access if you want to get in from some of these locations. But on the actual, so if you were just a merchant showing up in Guernsey, so far as I can tell, you would sell through an intermediary, and that would be warehoused, and the smuggler might buy from the intermediary. So it's not like this is being done in a clandestine way on Jersey or Guernsey or the Isle of Man. This is completely open. And this is constantly reiterated in the sources. This is absolutely open.
Great stuff. Thanks, David. Now, I want to bring it on to a comment and a question from Emily, who's our resident networks expert. Do you want to ask the question yourself, Emily?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, my comment is quite long, but mainly because I found the topic so interesting, because I've looked at similar types of places within the context of the Liverpool-New York trade, but really from a perspective of trade during wartime, when they're trying to evade embargoes, and they find these really odd little locations, but they use those locations and then they discard them. So they don't sort of establish long-term networks with any of those places. So I guess maybe this is something that you'll get more from the sources when you go look at the local sources, but these networks that they establish, what's the longevity there? I mean, how embedded are they? Are they establishing sort of long-term relationships between firms there? And just if you've seen sort of any evidence of that.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So, for example, the Liverpool Isle of Man trade, those are very multi-decade relationships between Liverpool trading houses and whoever their agents are on the Isle of Man, or whoever's interfacing with them. The Murrays, for example, are a good example of a group on the Isle of Man who are essentially intermediaries brokering the goods, organizing the goods, coordinating the goods so that when those ships from the Liverpool trading house arrive, that there's goods for them waiting in the port and so forth. So I would say that the relationships, as far as I can tell, are multi-decade. They do shift. So for example, I've been identifying the Guernsey wine and brandy merchants, but they have relationships in France, which are also multi-decade, but Guernsey's position in the brandy network, for example, is displaced in the 1720s. So it's still a very dynamic network, but it's not being caused by, maybe because it's a kind of a convenience, right, that they have this relationship. It's being caused by market conditions, right, because Guernsey brandy is no longer competitive against brandy that's run through Dunkirk, for example. So yeah, I mean, they're quite durable, the short answer.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Cheers, David. Thanks, Emily. On to Ian Jones. Ian, do you want to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, sure. Assuming you can hear me on this. I haven't got a camera, I'm afraid. Thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. Not that I know much about, so this might be a really simple question, but I just wanted to ask that these networks, how did they act compared to other businesses? Were they quite competitive with each other, or quite cooperative, or even more like cartels than traditional? Considering their legal situation, competition may not always be the best strategy. So I just wondered how they act.
It's an interesting, thank you. It's an interesting question. So the answer is both. So I just gave the example, for example, of the competition between Dunkirk and Guernsey over brandy. So that was clearly a competitive, and Dunkirk really grabs almost 100% of the market, actually. It's really, because we know the import figures. So it can be competitive. It's more often, I would say, typified by cooperation. And part of that is due to supply chain issues, but also due just to kind of networks and convenience, right? Because these people also sometimes do move from these. So we have, for example, people move from Ostend to Gothenburg and so forth. They're often the same people, right? And so there is a kind of a cooperative element in this. So I would say both. Sometimes what we do see with smugglers is interesting. There's a case in, when is it? In the 1710s or 1720s, when a company of merchants basically backs a kind of a small fleet of smugglers in the north of England around Newcastle and Berwick. And the business is to sell brandy to the coal miners up there. And that group, that little fleet, decides they're going to run a monopoly. And they say, you know, no other traders can trade brandy in this region. We will trade it. And so there is a kind of a monopolistic kind of attempt. And this causes a lot of consternation in the customs because they are actually outgunned by those ships for a time. They actually have to call on Navy ships. But yeah.
Thanks for that. That's interesting. So all types.
Great stuff. Thanks, Ian. Anna Knutson, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I think in part you've already answered my question, but I was just wondering, like many smuggling studies have observed that these pre-established networks and contacts, like Jacobite between Scotland, Sweden, and various other Ostend and such ports, and also like Freemason contacts and Jewish contacts, they have played a really important role in establishing these like silent networks of trust, which are particularly important to reach out to the people who are actually retailing at the end port. And I'm just wondering if you've seen anything like that in your studies. And I'm also wondering a little bit about the vested national interest in supporting this smuggling trade from other nations apart from the UK. And attempts to undermine the UK in various ways. So I know from the Swedish part, for example, they were really pushing to encourage the smuggling trade of tea and herring and such things to the colonies and also to the UK in order to undermine Britain so that they would become more competitive and cancel out the poor trade balance that they had. So I was just wondering if you see any of those things going into the project, because I think that would really heighten it quite a lot. But thank you, it was really interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Thanks and we have a lot to talk about, I know. So thank you. And I have to ask you about more about the Faroe Islands too. So what happened there? So the issue of trust, I mean, I think you do, but it's not. So for example, it happens in different ways. There's clearly a kind of a Irish-Scottish connection running through the Isle of Man, and that they are the ones who are initially kind of designing these schemes, right? Partly because a lot of them had pre-existing, I assume, experience in smuggling. And I think there's a lot of work still to do on Irish smuggling. And one of the ways Ireland becomes problematic for the British government in this regard is actually the growth of the Irish wool trade, right? And there's a constant attempts, as Hoppet is explained in the 18th century, to regulate that trade, right? So in terms of networks, I mean, I haven't really traced, I want to trace those northern networks because when we have Scots and Irish people involved in many of these continental companies, right? And so presumably that is that network. So in the south, in Guernsey and Jersey, right? I mean, these islands are in many ways French, right? I mean, they speak a kind of French. They see themselves as though they claim they're loyal British subjects, right? I mean, they're still proceeding by the custom of Normandy. One of the interesting things, and if you look at Newfoundland sources, is that they're often referring to the French fishing fleet. And so when it comes, and so I think actually what they actually mean is not just maybe French fleets from parts of France, but actually of Guernsey and Jersey in particular, which sends a kind of a cod fleet. So I think that the Jersey and Guernsey kind of diaspora, their kind of participation is a network in and of itself, right? Because the islanders have their own customs, but it also allows them perhaps, though I don't know for sure, to interface more closely with traders in France and to see themselves also as in a way French, right? So that would be one way that network would be there. I don't see, I mean, there's often the question about Jacobite networks. I have to say, in the 1720s and 1730s, you don't really see a lot of it. I mean, there's an interesting case, and I don't want to go on about this, but there's an interesting case. When is it? because they're still watching for these kind of Jacobite networks that are running some of these smuggling groups, as you know, Paul Monod has discussed. But I don't see it as a kind of a major, certainly in the 1720s, 1730s, it's not recognized as a major kind of driver, those kind of Jacobite networks, at least in the literature, in the material I've seen. To your question about the intentionality of states using these spaces. So for example, and I would agree with this, I was going to talk about Dunkirk, but I didn't have time, but Renaud Moreau has also discussed this, that Dunkirk is the permissiveness of the French government around Dunkirk is partly to do because they know Dunkirk is this huge haven in this huge conduit for smuggling into Britain. And I suspect also they're well aware of what's happening in Guernsey and Jersey. So the answer to your question is yes. Do I see it on the English side? You know, the closest I see, I've been really looking for this. I mean, I think that you can start to see evidence of this in a kind of private capacity, self-organizing capacity with British smuggling in the Caribbean in the 1730s and 1720s, right? So that is one possibility. But where I see it is there's that odd in 1709, 1710 allowance of basically Jersey and Guernsey to ship these goods to any duty-free and not subject to search or seizure to anywhere other than England. So in that regard, that could be evidence that they're thinking in these ways. But to be honest, I haven't yet found evidence that Britain is necessarily using these ports specifically against other nations or to address the balance of trade. They seem more anxious about it. Does that answer your question, Anna?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, but yeah, it's something that has to be observed. I'm looking for it.
Excellent, thanks, Anna. Great question. Stefano Tigurina, do you want to expand? I think it's linked about looking at different territories. Do you want to expand on your point, Stefano?
Well, continuing, thank you very much. And continuing with what Susan just said, perhaps I'm curious if the focus of the region that you are looking at is perhaps just part of a bigger picture of the same expansion of these strategies of trade, because my own research with Canada and Latin America led me to the Jamaican entrepot, which basically operated in the same way that you just described, but in the Caribbean, but in this case with Susan's agenda of perhaps outperforming the Spanish Empire by using illegality as a way to outperform the competitor of the times. And definitely, history showed that it was effective. So I'm just curious if this has, when you say this is a group project, is that because this is a more global picture? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So absolutely. I mean, I do see this as a global picture. What I want to do first is really understand more closely this nearer network and the density of this near network, for which I can't do this alone. I mean, I'm not a specialist in French history or French trade or Dutch history. So really need specialists to understand this near network, which has connections, as you pointed out, globally, right, through some of these company ports, but also sometimes directly. So again, Newfoundland, there's a lot of discussion of sources about the Guernsey trade with the West Indies and specifically in rum, but I haven't followed up on that because I'm still reconstructing more of this kind of local network. So I mean, absolutely. I mean, one of the other ways to see it, so I'm working on a paper now, it's a little late for me, it's in the 1780s on St. Eustatius, which is another one of these. I mean, it's an incredible free port. And as people know, in the 1780s, St. Eustatius was surprised by a British fleet. And so what I'm doing is I'm looking at basically everything that was seized there and what the ownership relationships were. And unexpectedly, a lot of these ships have some sort of ownership relationship with British merchants, even though St. Eustatius is a conduit to the American revolutionaries for things like weapons and so forth. So through these methods, I mean, we can start to actually construct that larger network. But right now, I'm really just focused on this closer network, which, certainly elements of it like Guernsey and Jersey and so forth have been discussed in various ways, but I think could actually be thought more, that work needs to be to think of it more holistically as this network. Does that answer your question, Stefano?
Yes, thank you so much. Okay. More than anything, it's illuminating to put the puzzle pieces together. Thank you so much.
Yeah, because I think sometimes people assume these places really only exist in, further from the metropole, right? But here are these major ports right under, like you can see on this map, right under the customs, right? I mean, all those blue dots are customs offices and, stations. So, I mean, there it is, right in the center. So that's why I've become very interested in this area. And then I'll move outward.
Excellent. Well, that was an excellent presentation, David. Really fantastic stuff. And the Q&A from the audience afterwards was fantastic. So thank you, audience, for coming and joining and attending. Thanks, David, for preparing a really excellent presentation. We've run out of our hours run out of time, I'm afraid. But there was a question, there was a comment or a question, or I don't know, half an essay from Andrew Smith. But I think you can continue that offline, because you know Andrew anyway. And there's a recommendation for a text that could be helpful from Masson Saint Hilaire. You might find a book by Aaron Water on whiskey. We can download all the comments for you, David, and send them to you, so you'll be able to review them again in your own time. But
yeah, thank you. And sorry, just on that point, I mean, Scotland's very interesting because there are liberties in Scotland where actually whiskey distilleries, develop because they're essentially duty-free, because they're these ancient kind of liberties. So it's a really great comment from St. Hilaire. Thank you.
Don't get us going on whiskey when Neil Mackenzie's in the room, because, we'll be here for another hour and a half, and that's just drinking it. But listen, we've got a programme plans for spring summer for the Business History Collective seminar series that's going to be getting circulated in the next couple of weeks. So we look forward to seeing you all at future talks. David, once again, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. Great presentation. We'll put you in touch with something like, I know that Emily might be able to give you some help with the Liverpool US, and we know some people that are doing African trade, and obviously Neil can put you in touch with people from Glasgow who are doing stuff on the sugar trade. It always makes me wonder about if the illicit trade and the smuggling trade was so buoyant and so open and so easy to access, then what was the motivation for doing proper trade, legal trade? But that's a discussion for another time. So yeah, thank you very much. Great talk, and thank you everyone else.
Thank you.
Right, I am going to stop the recording.